and refresh the slides. I don't know, can I do that?
Sure. Hi. I start with refreshing. Oh, I see two
It's already
versions.
there.
Yeah, thanks. Now updating the notes. Okay, good. Yeah, we are on top of the hour now, but as usual, let's wait 4 minutes or so to start. Hi, John. Okay, it's 3 past, so I think we can actually start the meeting. So welcome everyone. This is an interim meeting of the co-working group. I'm Marco, my co-chairs are Hanna and Karsten. And this is an official IETF meeting, so the not well applies. You have to disclose any personal knowledge you have of IPR patents and so on, or refrain from participating in the technical discussion. And it's also in the special about our code of conduct, so please be nice and professional with one another. We have one main agenda item for today. It's the core CLAR document, and at least and especially one point raised by Karsten in the context of the recent discussion on the conditional attributes document. So how to handle query parameters in general on the co-op server side. There's also an AOB point that I'm sure we have time to also get on. Any more items or any agenda bashing of some kind? Okay, if none, it's up to Karsten and your slides.
Okay. Yeah, we have talked about query parameters in the last couple of weeks. And I wanted to give a quick overview of what the actual issues are here before we go to discussing how we are actually going to handle these issues. today is not so much about decisions, but more about discussing procedural aspects. Okay, so first of all, we all know that URIs have a query component, or at least an optional query component, which is started with a question mark. And RFC 7252, the COAP document, supports these query components by splitting them on ampersand characters and putting the results of that split into 0 or more URI query parameters. So this is all fine. And there's also an expectation that people generally have that query parameters will be of the form name equals value, or occasionally just a name for something that could be called a Boolean query parameters. But nothing in the specification says they have to be that way. It's just an expectation that is easy to support in a COAP implementation as well. You just search for the equal sign, and if it's not present, it's a Boolean. Otherwise, you have a value. The interesting question is, what role do these query components play in the entire URI? So we are aware that fragment identifiers have a very special role because they only control local processing, so they are very different from other components. But RFC 3986 takes the position that query components and path components are essentially the same, except that one is non-hierarchical and the other is hierarchical. And these all together identify a resource. So if you change a query parameter, you are talking to a different resource. So each query you can place on a server actually is theoretically a different resource. And that's certainly a useful thing for caching. So we are definitely not going to change that. But there is a little bit of a more practical view where RFC 7252 seems to acknowledge that query parameters often parameterize a resource. So this sentence, which is in 3 places approximately in the same way, I haven't cited all of them, essentially says, the query serves to further parameterize the resource. Or maybe it's parameterizing the resource name. We don't really know. So this is one of the things that actually should be the subject of corrections and clarifications. If we have an unclear specification, then we should do something about that. But the reality is that most of us, when we configure our servers, we install a handler for a path and have query parameters handed in. So in the big web, we usually have more complicating routing components in the servers, and those routing components are concerned with parsing the URI essentially and assigning some of the things that can be found in there to parameters that will be handed into a handler, and using other parts to actually find the correct handler in the first place. And of course, this is all very much influenced by HTML forms, which was the initial main user of query parameters. So HTML forms allowed you to let the user put in data and then send back a request that has the data in the form encoded into query parameters, at least if it's a GET. So this is not quite consistent with the true faith view, but it's not really hurting very much because we are not really, there is no damage from this. Now, the question really comes up, can we actually standardize these query parameters? So clearly, if we need to put something that is really at the CoAP level. We can always specify CoAP options, and we know how to do that. We write a specification what the option is supposed to do, and then we register the name, which in the case of CoAP is a number, and bind that option number to the specification by doing that registration. So we have a very, very nice way of actually adding these extensions. We have an extension point. But query parameters never were meant as an extension point in a way. They were really meant as a way for the server to allow things to come in via HTML forms or some other client-side processing that nonetheless is really controlled by the server. So the server sends the HTML form, the client acts on it by filling in the query parameters, and the whole thing is sent back. So that's a more interesting question. And there actually is a BCP 190, that many of you probably still know it as RFC 7320. It's now RFC 8820. Which makes a big difference between two kinds of specifications. So an application is allowed to specify the syntax of the UI within the limits of the scheme, and that specifically means, and this is essentially a copy from the RFC, applications can specify the syntax of queries for the resources under their control. Of course, and more specifically, the server does that, and the application may be something that client and server agree about that they are trying to run. But it also says extensions must not constrain the format of or semantics of queries to avoid collisions and erroneous client assumptions. So there is a problem here that this RFC reacts to, which is if you actually constrain the format of a URI, the way your server is already configured and interacts with other applications also running on the same server may run into conflicts. So we have an explicit allow in the first specification, in the first sentence, and very explicit must not in the second sentence. So really the question boils down to, is something we might be specifying about query parameters just an application or part of an application, a reusable part of an application maybe? Or is it actually an extension that could apply to any URI? I think that's really where we have to make up our mind, because the application is the application, but extensions might be combined with other extensions, and then we run into these conflict issues. So that's the BCP. And of course, that applies to any new normative specification we make. And yeah, we have to think about this when we want to do extensions. Now we have one document, the document that has the misleading name conditional attributes. It really is about conditional query parameters, and I'm going to abbreviate this as CQP in the rest of the slides, which actually does specify a set of query parameters. So they are called conditional because they control the conditions under which a server sends back notifications for a client's observe registration. So they essentially specify detailed specifics for that observe registration, and that has turned out to be a pretty useful thing for many applications. Now, this could have been using CoAP options, but the assumption is that many of these specifics actually fit very well into a URI. So we want to put these conditional query parameters into a URI, and that makes them natural candidates to be query parameters. But this specification is kind of between an application and an extension. It's an extension because it's widely applicable to any applications that use observe. But also it's an application because it has some rather application-specific semantics. So things that I wouldn't necessarily be particularly comfortable with putting into an option. So that's one thing we have to make up our minds of which of these two is it. Now, one interesting point came up that a server might actually indicate some aspect of its application using target attributes. And we have two target attributes. We have RT, which is essentially just saying this is this particular type of resource, so it's essentially the application. And we also have IF equals the interface type, which a server can actually conform to several of. A server that indicates the presence of a resource for resource discovery could use the IF equals target attribute to say, oh, by the way, I understand those conditional query parameters. And that might be a way to really make sure that there can't be a conflict. So a server that is entirely oblivious of all this and calls this a particular query c.borman, that would not conflict if it doesn't also say IF equals conditional query parameters. Okay, so that's one thing we could do, but that's over in the conditional query parameters draft, so we can solve that there, and I would expect that something like this will be in the next revision of that. One question that came up is, given that the set of conditional query parameters is going to grow, and we even have a registry in the conditional query parameters document that allows registering new conditional query parameters. How do we handle the fact that the server might not actually know about a query parameter that the client wants to use? And one very powerful way of handling extensibility is the ignore unknown principle, which means a client is free to say something, and if a server doesn't understand it, it just ignores what the client just said. And applied to query parameters, this means the server that uses an ignore unknown policy either applies them to all query parameters, that's easy, but if the server doesn't want to apply them to all, but just to the conditional query parameter ones, then it needs to be able to detect which of the query parameters are conditional query parameters and which are other query parameters, which of course you also want to be able to put into the UI. And yeah, one obvious approach would be to detect the C dot prefix, but again, this would only be reasonable if we combine it with the interface type indication that the server actually knows what the C dot thing means. So that would be an easy way to do the ignore unknown policy. And now, of course, we have another question. Most applications that use ignore unknown at some point notice that there actually are must understand parameters as well. We have that in CoAP in the form of critical options. So a specific option is either elective or critical. So it's a property of the option whether it's must understand. That probably doesn't make sense here. Instead, the client could independently set a bit that indicates a particular conditional query parameter is critical. And I have suggested a convention for that. We don't have to do it this way, but just to indicate that this is easy to do. So let's say if the conditional query parameter name starts with an uppercase C and a dot, then it's a must understand one. So again, we have the need to identify a conditional query parameter as such, in such a way that the client can be certain that if the server doesn't understand the parameter, the request fails. And the specific reason why this came up was that if we have parameters that essentially do rate limiting, the client may not want to set up an observation that would overwhelm it. So it would rely on the server to understand something like a minimum period of notification. Okay, so we have solutions here, but both solutions essentially hinge on parsing the name of the query parameter and reserving a specific prefix or two specific prefixes for conditional query parameters. And we cannot really do this throughout the CoAP universe. That wouldn't be allowed by BCP 190, but we can tie it to an interface type, I think. Now, final slide, and the reason why this agenda item also has the corrections and clarifications document, while we were doing this text analysis, what the existing documents actually say, we found these places where the CoAP standard talks about parameterizing the resource. And of course, we could just reinterpret this or read this as parameterize the resource name. As you know, in English, we often don't make a distinction between a thing and the name of a thing. And we would just put in a clarification into the core cloud document that says, oh, this is meant to be parameterized the resource name, and we don't get excommunicated by not following the true faith on this. So that would be a very simple thing to add to the document, but I'm not really feeling very satisfied with that because this subject needs more explanation and more discussion. And I made a PR 47 that actually shows what I think, the extent of what I think should be in this, should be clarified or explained somewhere. So this is not so much a clarification in the sense of something isn't read the same thing by everybody, but it's a clarification in the sense of something is not explained that readers of this document would have to find out on their own. Yeah, so we write some text that in the next document update probably will go into the document. Now we can do this explanation right in the document that specifies something about query parameters. And that is certainly one thing we could do. We could update the conditional query parameters internet graph to contain more information about query parameters. We could also use the existing informational documents we have and the RESTful IoT document, which was just updated a couple of hours ago. That would be an obvious place to put something of this. And actually, there is some text already about query parameters there that we could extend. But it's kind of decoupled from the normative specification. It's just an informational document. Or we could actually put in stuff like this into the corrections and clarifications document. And that's really the question I have for today. So do we collect more informational parts in the corrections and clarifications document when they actually serve to clarify something that is not explained in the base specifications? Okay, so I think there are 5 people in this room right now. So please just speak up, don't bother with the queue.
Well, Marco here, but just wanted to be sure no one else had to say anything before I start. But no one's in the queue, or no one types in the chat. Okay, I start. Yeah, for conditional attributes, that's probably the easy one. We can just say whatever applies specifically to that document. I think following those proposals about IF and C lowercase, uppercase as a start, what clarifying and what to inform about can be a bit more delicate to understand exactly. So maybe for convenience, it's more practical to just start in core clar, and when things are clear, something can be moved out to the T2TRG document. But yeah, it makes sense that it's about those two, and we can understand later on what exactly fits best where. Yeah, that's the high level picture. Then on two more specific comments, I think slide 9 was about the C lowercase uppercase. Yeah, thanks. So that's a concrete proposal for conditional attributes and should work fine. I wonder if this can even become a general pattern, or maybe that was the intention from the start, about how to use query parameters in this sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if we actually opt for this for the conditional query parameters document, that of course will set an example, and people will pull this in for other applications as well.
Yeah, and generalizing it also may open for constraints that may conflict with that BCP, because you're basically setting the ground for starting with a letter. And I'm not sure that's mandated altogether for a query parameter, right? You may start with a number in the parameter name.
Yeah, but then you don't get to the
Then you
client
cannot
to
do
say
that
must
anymore.
understand.
Yes. So to take advantage of that trick in general, you need to mandate the query parameter name to start with the letter, and that may not be good. Okay, so any generalization can be limited.
So what's currently the syntax for what does conditional query parameters say about the names that can be registered in that registry?
I think it says that they have to start with C dot, but I should double check.
No, actually it doesn't. It doesn't. In the security consideration, it starts saying, oh, maybe it would have been a good idea to say that, but it doesn't actually say that in the IANA considerations.
Okay.
And I agree with the security considerations. Maybe it would have been a good idea to say that.
But were you thinking of taking advantage of this uppercase, lowercase for must understand in general beyond the conditional attributes draft?
Well, it's a convention that may be applicable in other places. That doesn't mean we now have to change all documents to allow that. But for documents that actually could benefit from a must understand functionality, I think this would work quite well generally. I mean, it's just a bit in that character that in this case actually isn't set but cleared, the lowercase bit. So lowercase c is hex 6.3 and uppercase c is hex 4.3. So it's literally a bit. And so that from an implementation point of view, that's actually maybe quite useful.
So I guess the adoption of this convention is protocol specific, and it has to be described by the document specifying the protocol.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that avoids also any problem of too good to be general. Okay. The other point I had was on IF. I think it was on slide, I don't know, 7, maybe. Yes. Yeah, if I remember correctly, the IF target attribute can have practically multiple interfaces indicated separated by space. So this proposal is about indicating, let's say, one interface to start as admitting a certain set of query parameters. If you indicate multiple interfaces, you need to be sure that a parameter with the same name but with different meanings is involved, right?
Can you say that again?
you may have two totally separate interfaces
Yes.
that both involve the possible use of a query parameter named foo. But with one interface, foo means something. With another interface, foo means something else. And then you advertise a link where IF mentions both interfaces. So you are
Don't do
saying,
that.
right. I'm thinking of considerations on not doing that.
Yeah, so that's another place where this prefix actually comes in handy. But of course, this assumes that people watch what prefixes are in use. But the general observation is that the server is actually indicating all these interface types. And the server needs to make sure that these interface types are not mutually excluding each other. So I think we have a well-defined responsibility here, even if we know that we cannot fully exclude a collision here.
Okay. Yeah, those were my thoughts. So it's mostly in the territory of considerations, really. Thanks for this. Any more comments or questions, anyone?
So I'd really like to hear from John if there are any implementation views on this.
Yeah, so that until this conversation started, I had always thought of the resource as just being specified by the URI and the host IP, etc., not the query parameters, and just treated the query parameters as we can, application layer level type stuff. We can query that particular resource and ask for a subset of information. I also have in my mind is kind of the query component that's sitting in fetch, where that's part of the body of the data, and that just complicates all this.
Yes, that's already true for post.
Yeah, so that kind of from that there. In terms of implementation, you refer to in your update reference to libcoapp, and it treats just the URI path as being the resource name, not parameterized further by the queries. So I guess that's where I come from at that level there. So I can understand. So if one's taking, for instance, caching proxy type stuff, then the cached entity would be the URI path plus the URI query, because the cached response may be different depending on what the query parameters are. So at the proxy type layer level, in terms of caching, then yes, the query is included as part of the resource, in quotes, albeit a proxy resource being cached. So yeah, it's a complete mismatch of everything here. So there's no real clarity, I guess, which is why we're having this discussion here.
Yeah, I think the server can organize its routing and the way incoming requests are given to different handlers in any way that's expedient for the server. So we don't need to standardize that. And as you say, the practical implementations usually just look up the path and then hand in the query parameters to the handler. And that is, of course, in no way precluded by saying the whole thing is the resource identifier. But I think it's really useful to have this slightly dialectic view on this subject in mind. So that's why I think it's really good to have that explanation in the document.
Sure.
So I asked Olaf this morning to provide me with an example, but unfortunately he was busy teaching, so I didn't get that in time. But I think it would be useful to have some actual code in there showing how people are actually programming this.
Sure. Well, I certainly know how I program. How other people who are using the libcoapp do it is, in that sense, up to them. But yeah, it's at the moment, the code really only supports you define the URI path that you're interested in. And
So
then
maybe you can.
And then it's the handler that deals with any parameters that come in and do whatever it likes.
So maybe you can supply me with a couple lines of code that I can put in there.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, any more comments or questions? So I guess the immediate next use of this along the direction we discussed already is updating conditional attributes with respect to IF for discoverability, and yeah, also for the convention on critical or non-critical query parameters. But that's up to Bill and the editors to work on.
Yeah, okay. And I have a PR where I wouldn't mind getting some feedback.
Right, and you mentioned that even some content from that PR is provisionally there, but can actually be moved out to conditional attributes.
Yeah, so I would expect there is some discussion of this in conditional attributes, and this text would then just point to that discussion where it really is about the conditional query parameters document.
All right. So I'm sure Bill will take this on. Thank you again, Karsten. So that brings us to the end of the body of the agenda, but not less important, of course. We have this item now on the AUB. Yes, there's a working group adoption call still ongoing for a few hours on Yangtze Pen. So I could just see restated and new positive views on the document. So I could count Michael, Andy, and Alexander. There was some in detail already discussion on points raised by Alexander on the list, and I think Michael just replied on that again. So all in favor, really, with some points for improvements and clarifications in the draft as it goes. Do you want to chime in on those points, Michael?
This is on the SID question, because
right.
I don't have anything more to say. I think it's important. I think we should do it. It seems not controversial. Alex has some concerns for the document, but that can happen afterwards, or Alexander. So yeah, to me, it seems very non-controversial. It just, we have to, I guess, ask for those mega ranges to be reserved for this purpose. And so we actually do need a document. At some point I thought we didn't even need a document, but it was just a BCP, but no, we need a document to reserve those. I think Karsten clarified for me.
You actually allocate, not reserve, but yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I'm probably one of the few people who really insists on using the INR terminology, but I get confused too quickly if we don't do that. So I think that the comment that Alex had, essentially, we have the same concerns. I think we have a slightly different view of what will actually happen when we agree on this document. And I think we need to understand why we have different predictions here, and make sure that we haven't overlooked a doomsday scenario that we really want to avoid. So I think that will be a good discussion once this is a working document, but I don't think there is any difference in terms of the objectives that in the end we want to achieve.
Thank you. Looks good then. Oh, Michael.
Sorry, I had nothing else to add, but it sounded like Karsten was waiting for a reply.
Yeah, don't expect.
I think that's what happened. He just fell off. That's why. Oh no, he's still there. Okay, confused.
What can be confusing a little bit on the list is that some comments didn't happen on the working group adoption thread, but I think on the thread that Karsten built right after the submission of the latest version. But it's fine. It's still possible to follow well. All right, yeah, I don't expect really any surprise on this. And thanks for your comments and contribution. Okay, we are at about half of the time allotted originally, but now looks like we are really at the end of the extended agenda. So anything more you want to discuss about core today? If none, thanks for today. Let's close the meeting. Thanks a lot, Rikard, for taking notes. And talk to you in 2 weeks. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.